more confident about things. And there's a reason for that. It's just I've spent a lot of time on it. I had the privilege of taking like 3 classes on it when I worked on my master's. And yeah, it's something I read about, I've written papers about. It's just an area of strong interest in my life. Now, having said that, it doesn't mean by any means I'm an expert on it. Okay, the experts are the Civil War professors who teach at our great institutions and colleges across the country. They're the experts. What I can tell you is I've read a lot of their material and listened to a lot of their lectures, and much of that informs, of course, what I try to teach you. Okay. It also doesn't mean that I won't make mistakes or things like that, or there won't be things that you guys know more than me because you're smart kids. But it is an area that I am somewhat passionate about. Okay. So what I want to deal with today is much of what exists in chapter 12, and I did attach questions to that a little bit later yesterday. Hopefully you started working on that last night. You do have questions related to chapter 12 due tomorrow, but also some other things that I've learned over the years. So let me share my screen. I'm only going to go about a half hour. I am allowed to go longer than a half hour with you kids. We're allowed to do that with our AP or our college courses, but I'm not going to do that to you. Unless I need to, of course, to finish up a key point or something. So indulge me a few minutes over if needed. Okay. Now notice the title of this, right? The title of this is The South and the Slavery Controversy. And the first thing that I want to impart upon you is slavery is the key cause of the Civil War. Anybody who tells you that is probably being too much of a Southern apologist or maybe even too much of a patriot. Now notice I said too much. There are other causes with the Civil War. But slavery, to quote Abraham Lincoln, was the rub. It was the issue that caused the war. There was a vested interest in slavery by those who were profiting off it, and an invested effort to expand it, which you should be finding out about that as you read chapter 12. And that goal to expand slavery is going to be the cause of the Civil War, because there is a vested interest by those who exist in free states to not see it expand. Whether they were abolitionists or whether they were just concerned about the economics of it and opportunities for free laborers, those who wanted to actually get paid for their labor being taken away. These are the two competing interests that will lead to the Civil War. Once again, anybody who argues that slavery isn't the primary cause of the Civil War really probably needs to examine things more, and they probably should absorb the readings of the Southern writers themselves, the Southern leaders themselves. There's speeches by Southern leader after Southern leader where they themselves are saying that this is the reason for the war. There are some other causations, in particular Northern tariffs and things like that. It's not the only cause, but it is the key one. And just let me give you some more with that as I kind of continue my introductory statement to this presentation. Slavery was $1 billion industry by 1860. $1 billion industry. It was more profitable than cotton itself. I want you to think about that for a moment. We're talking $1 billion in 1860. Kids, I went to the inflation calculator earlier. That would be $31 trillion now. So $1 billion in 1860 would be $31 trillion now. $1 million in 1860 was $31 million in relation to our current time period. So there's a tremendous amount of wealth wrapped up in slavery, and therefore people who were benefiting off that wealth, quite frankly, didn't want to see it end. And I mentioned how often Southern leaders were the ones who were making arguments for its continued existence. One of the best ones to look at would be Alexander Stephens. Alexander Stephens was the vice president of the Confederacy during the Civil War. And I want to show you some key quotes from what became known as his cornerstone speech here. So this is from Alexander Stevenson's cornerstone speech. I don't know if you know what a cornerstone is, but a cornerstone is the cornerstone of a building, right? It goes in the foundation. It's like the brick that the building is built on. It is the foundation. And if you read his speech, he explains the need for secession, and there are other reasons he gives. But the cornerstone is the existence of slavery and racial hierarchy. That, according to the Vice President of the Confederacy, is the key reason. So here's his quote. Here's a couple of quotes from his speech. African slavery as it exists amongst us, the proper status of the Negro in our form of civilization. This was the immediate cause of the late rupture and present revolution. He calls secession the Civil War or revolution, right? This was the immediate cause. He quotes Jefferson here, who was worried about slavery causing the end of the Union. Jefferson in his forecast had anticipated this as the rock upon which the old Union would split. He was right. This is the Vice President of the Confederacy. Our new government is founded upon exactly the opposite idea. This is in reference to the Declaration of Independence. So this is Alexander Stephens arguing against all men are created equal. Our new government is founded upon exactly the opposite idea. Its foundations are laid. Its cornerstone rests upon the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man, that slavery's subordination to the superior race is his natural and normal condition. This, our new government, is the first in the history of the world, based upon this great physical, philosophical, and moral truth. Once again, this is the Vice President of the Confederacy. And these aren't the only speeches that you can find or the only writings you find with Southern leaders that connect the primary cause of the rupture in the nation as slavery and the extension of it. To be honest, kids, in 1860, everybody knew what the war was about. It's only now that we debate it. Now, of course, they attach this argument to states' rights. And part of the other issue is how much did the federal government get involved in the states and governing themselves, which is a key issue that comes up many times. But you have to connect states' rights to a cause. Why are you yelling state rights? In this case, they were yelling states' rights because they felt states should be the decisions on slavery, right? And they also felt that states should be able to extend to the territories. So you're connecting states' rights to something. States' rights was not first used by Southern leaders. It was first used by abolitionists of the North in refusing to fulfill the Fugitive Slave Act. You may remember when the Constitution was formed, one of the compromises was fugitive slaves can be returned to their owners. The federal government enforced that. Guess what Northern abolitionists yelled? It is the right of our state to refuse this law. This is a states' rights issue. We will not return these fugitives. Guess what? Many times they still had to. And in that instance, you didn't see Southern leaders yelling states' rights, right? They were totally fine with federal enforcement of that, right? So you can't just say it was about states' rights. You have to connect what the states' rights argument is connected to. Who's yelling states' rights? Why are they yelling states' rights? Who's yelling individual rights? Why are they yelling individual rights? Who's yelling that the federal government should have power? Why are they yelling that the federal government should have power? What are the reasons? What are the causations? Okay, so that's my opening statement. I guess I get a little bit fired up when people want to dismiss our history and dismiss the reality of this issue. How embedded slavery was in our culture, at least in the South in this time period. And so that's much of what chapter 12 is about. And what we want to look at is the history behind that. Okay, so let's go back a little bit. Let's go back to 1790. 1790, so here's a map, is when slavery started to be introduced in greater numbers in the United States. And what we see is the darker concentrations being the darker concentrations of slave populations, the highest density, right? We're along the southeastern seaboard. And you'll notice the concentration of slavery in South Carolina, which will be the strongest proponent of secession really since the time period of Andrew Jackson. Now, we had to skip over the Jackson presidency, which once again pains me. But a key issue of the Jackson presidency was South Carolina wanting to nullify federal laws because they were concerned about federal laws on slavery, but also treatment of Native Americans. So South Carolina was threatening nullification and secession during the Jackson presidency, and Jackson said secession is illegal. Jackson actually agreed with some of the things that South Carolina was arguing for, but he believed more strongly in the Union. So South Carolina is kind of a leader on this. And some of that is connected to the fact that they were the first state to import slaves in large numbers. And you may remember the crop that was being grown in South Carolina that led to the importation of slavery during colonial times was rice. The west coast of Africa, the peoples of the west coast of Africa, had knowledge in rice cultivation, and they were also resistant to the diseases that came with it. So they were kind of a commodity, a free labor force that came over. But also we'll see tobacco and sugar begin to evolve in South Carolina and the surrounding regions as well, Virginia, of course, will be very big with tobacco. Okay. Now, I'm sure you've heard the story probably back in junior high of Eli Whitney's cotton gin. I think it's unfair to blame Eli Whitney entirely for the expansion of slavery, but unfortunately for poor Eli, and I say poor Eli in this case because he hardly profited off this invention. There were some patent issues. He really didn't get a lot of money off of it, even though it revolutionized the picking of cotton, which in and of itself is not a bad thing. Revolutionizing the picking of cotton, which led to the growth of Southern agriculture economy, right? And also industry in the North and access to clothing, right? I mean, this is a good invention, at least on its surface. The problem is the demand in slaves that it also contributed to. What happened is a cotton gin was invented in 1793. It will lead to the expansion of cotton plantations. Before this, it required hundreds of man hours to separate cotton seed from raw cotton fibers. I don't know if you've ever seen raw cotton, the plant, but it's got like little seeds in it. And so before the cotton gin, you literally had to pick the cotton and then pull the seeds out. Can you imagine how tedious that was? So you're talking hundreds of man hours. I don't know how it works. I've never seen one. I'm sure you can tour a plantation and see one in action. But the cotton gin took the manpower out of that. It separated the seeds, okay? This machine automated the seed process. It could generate up to 50 pounds of clean cotton daily. So cotton, as a result, will be shipped to British and US textile mills. But it did not. A lot of times when you see the invention of machinery, it reduces labor, right? It reduces labor needs. The cotton gin had the opposite effect. It actually caused an increase in slave labor because what happens is if you can produce that much cotton, you're going to want bigger fields, more land, more plantations, and the cotton still has to be picked, right? And so therefore it actually sped up or actually increased the demand for slave labor. Okay, so cotton is king. You've probably heard that phrase before. The South used to yell this, and as a matter of fact, they kind of yelled it as an error leading up to the Civil War because they believed that because cotton was king, that they could secede and be as successful economically as they were when they were in the Union. That doesn't turn out to be the case. The industrial might of the North will be a key factor in winning the Civil War, but you can see the production of cotton from 1800 to 1860. It's tremendous growth. And by 1860, cotton will account for 57.5% of US exports. Cotton will dramatically overtake the production of other crops. Once again, the cotton gin invention is key to this. It becomes, by 1860, it's the second industry in the South. The first is profit in slaves. Spread of slavery. So we're looking at these two maps. So here's 1790, right? The map I just showed you. And now we're going to look at slave populations in the southern states by 1860. Now I keep bringing up 1860 because that's the year before the Civil War. By 1860, slavery had spread over the entire South. The darker regions on this map, of course, represent the greater slave concentrations. So this is no longer a majority coastal phenomenon. And notice the concentrations in the deeper South. These are the cotton states. The upper states of the South are not as reliant upon cotton. As a matter of fact, Virginia's #1 crop in 1860 was wheat. So you see some heavy concentrations of slavery in Virginia, but not nearly to the degree of some of these more cotton states down here, okay? And the fear of slaves is being sold down the river, right? Being sold down to these cotton plantations. Okay, so by 1860, slavery had spread over the entire South. Small-scale cotton farming, of course, did not require slave labor, whereas large operations involved many slaves. And of course, we're talking about cotton plantations, which involved hundreds of acres of land and many, many fields of cotton, right? Now, well, let me go to the map here. I've got the map again here. And let me know if I need to slow down, kids. Don't be afraid to speak up. What I hate about Zoom is we're more interactive in class, but anyway, by 17, so in 1790, right, there are fewer than 700,000 slaves. The increase in cotton production will eventually lead to 4 million by 1860. When Lincoln signs the Emancipation Proclamation, or when the 13th Amendment is finally issued, the slaves that'll be freed number, according to some counts, of 3.5 to 4 million. Okay, so we go from 700,000 in 1790 to 3.5 to 4 million by 1860. Okay, and here once again, this is a good map here because it shows the cotton density of the Deep South, or the cotton region of the Deep South. Let's see, rice still factor on the coast, right? South Carolina right here, right? But on into Georgia here, okay? Virginia, we still see tobacco, right? And then it looks like we've got tobacco out here in Kentucky and Tennessee, okay? Sugar, Louisiana. Slave labor, very needed in sugar. Louisiana will be one of our key sugar producing states really then and now in the United States. Sugar is another very intensive form of labor to pick sugar cane. Think about that every time you put sugar in your coffee. Slave life. So what I want to focus upon is a little bit of a history, of course, of slavery and how it changed, African Americans and how they tried to maintain some of their culture in slavery and how they dealt with slavery. But I also want to get into Southern society a little bit, and your text does a good job about this. Okay, and I won't get through all this today, of course. I'm going to continue this on Thursday. This is information that I really want to present to you, and I have a lot here, including some videos I'd like to show you. Okay, so slave life. Slavery in the United States changed over the years. In the early 1700s, slave men actually outnumbered slave women, and many were born in Africa, meaning they had been part of the international slave trade, brought over in the Middle Passage. I know you guys know much of the cruelties in the Middle Passage and how slaves were treated on that journey. But by the mid-1800s, the sex ratio became more even, and most slaves were actually born in the United States. And so what we're seeing is a change. You have to remember that Congress outlawed the African slave trade in 1808. Remember, there were founding fathers. This was debated at the Constitutional Convention to some degree. There were founding fathers who were troubled by slavery and would like to see it end. I even think that to some extent Thomas Jefferson was that way, even though he probably could have done more to end it as a slave owner. But I think he was troubled by it. And so they outlawed the international slave trade in 1808, perhaps due to the cruelties of the Middle Passage and some of the other things that were occurring. Now, there were still illegal shipments of slaves coming to the United States as late as 1860. As a matter of fact, if you watched 60 Minutes the other night, remember, I'm a history geek, but if you watched 60 Minutes the other night, they did a story about the Clotilda, which is considered the last slave ship. This came into Alabama in 1860 and was sank, I forget what river. It wasn't the Mississippi, but another major river in Alabama. When it was sank, it was burnt and sunk because they wanted to cover up the evidence of still bringing slaves illegally into 1860. So the international slave trade was occurring to some degree still in the United States illegally, but what we see was more of a domestic slave trade occurring from 1808 on, and therefore women became more valued because how do you perpetuate your product now? How do you make money off slaves if you can't be involved in the international slave trade? Well, you need female slaves as domestic servants, very valued in that respect. Many of them still had to work in the fields. But you also need them for slave perpetuation and reproduction, right? So you have female slaves being valued so they can mate with male slaves and therefore create more slaves for sale and work. Think about the consequences of that in terms of separated families. Slave life. A majority of slaves lived in large plantations with at least 10 slaves. Once again, cotton, right? They worked in what were called gangs. They were often under very close supervision. Overseers were tasked to do this. Most of the plantation owners did not want to do this dirty work, although some did. They typically hired overseers, which were often middle class to poor whites who, they just hired to work on the plantations. These overseers varied in their cruelty. Some were incredibly cruel, right, and violent, and even killed slaves at times. Others were, I guess, more humane. It's hard to argue humanity in the symptom, but they used violence less, right? But overseers were key to the running of the plantation and often controlled gangs of 10 men and often women as well. Okay. Typical plantation image here, maybe kind of idyllic, right? Plantation labor system going on here. To me, what's quite fascinating in really a lot of American stories, no matter the race, right? But just how people cope and how people overcome obstacles and incredibly difficult circumstances. This is actually a later image. This will be post-Civil War. This is on into the sharecropping Jim Crow era. This is probably early 1900s. But a typical slave life is they woke before sunrise, right? They ate and then went to the fields. They worked sunrise to sunset, particularly when it was time to pick cotton, harvest time, right? Which there are multiple harvests with cotton. You know, we think of Ohio harvesting typically in the fall, right? You got to remember the South, it's warm all year round. So there could be 3 or 4 harvests a year of cotton. It's a different type of crop that way. Typically they had a quota. The typical quota was 200 pounds of cotton. If they picked less, they would be whipped. If they picked more, they would find a new quota the next day. Now that was typical. You know, not every plantation was run the exact same. So what the slaves would literally try to do is try to find, how can I hit the exact number, right? Because you didn't want to be less, but you didn't necessarily want to be more. And then you had to complete chores at night. Now I want to share with you, once again, I am impressed with this textbook this year. So I'm reading it for the first time with you guys. I read a few chapters over the summer, but not the whole thing. But John Brown, now not the John Brown you're studying, Josh, okay? This is John Brown, who was a slave. But this is a great excerpt on him. Now, first of all, the first part of this talks about family separation, which is arguably the greatest cruelty of slavery. But he has a nice description of a typical day here, which I've highlighted. So he's talking about his overseer, all right? He would make his slaves work on 1 meal a day until quite night, and after supper, set them to burn brush or spin cotton. We worked from 4 in the morning till 12 before we broke our fast, and from that time till 11 or 12 at night. We labored 18 hours a day. So in many cases, they were getting as much labor as possible out of these people with as cheap as expenses they could, okay? Now, once again, not all plantations were run the same. You know, like when we read about Jefferson, maybe the one thing we can defend about him is he ran his plantation more humanely than some others. But then again, his plantation was up in Virginia. It was not a cotton crop plantation, right? Cotton is where the labor was the most intense, which once again is why slaves did not want to be sold down the river, symbolically speaking. You did not want to end up on a cotton plantation. That is where your life was going to be pretty cruddy, okay, pretty tough. Now, by the way, these slave narratives, during the 30s, the Work Progress Administration, one of the things that organization created by Franklin Roosevelt did is hired people to go record these stories. And slave narratives is an outstanding collection, just outstanding. I had to read some of them when I was working on my master's. And they're hard to read, broken English, but the information that comes from them is just fantastic, okay? So typical diet was cornmeal and salted pork. Not the most, you know, vitamin nutrient rich. You're looking for foods you can furnish rather cheaply and easily in mass, you know, that you can purchase in bulk, right? Okay, and often our troops were subject to the same type of meals in this time period. So typically 3 to 4 pounds of salted pork each week. I don't know if that's important, but that was in my notes here. Now, slaves, now it looks like on the plantation that John Brown worked on, he probably wouldn't have had time for this, but there were plantations in which slaves could, perhaps out by their cabins, right, have their own gardens. They could fish and hunt small animals. Typically Sundays were off for some slaves. So there were times in which they could do some things to maybe improve their diet, okay? And once again, it depended on the plantation system and the generosity of the master and things like that. And some of these circumstances will exist before some rebellions that occurred. More on that later. Typically, once again, they work 6 days per week and they earn money for Sunday work. Now, what would happen on Sundays is sometimes slaves would be Sometimes the plantation owner would hire the slave out to other farmers, yeoman farmers, other plantations, and the slaves could get paid for that work sometimes. Now, the more humane, once again, tricky word to use when you're talking about slavery, humane, but the more humane plantation owners sometimes let slaves keep that money. And eventually, some slaves were able to work up enough money to purchase their freedom. There were owners who did that. Some owners hired their slaves out and took most, if not all, that money. So even slaves being hired out was more for the plantation owner in some instances. So once again, it varied, okay, on how plantation owners, how paternalistic perhaps they felt themselves to be. They always like to argue they were paternalistic, right, in their owning of slaves. Okay. Now, Christmas typically was, Southerners, even plantation owners, despite slavery, and they actually have some biblical justifications for slavery, which I may not get to today, but I may have to wait till Thursday. But typically Christmas was celebrated, and even for slaves, this could be the best time of the year because they often gave them a few days off here. You often had 3 to 4 days off. This was the time they could eat the most, maybe spend the most time in their own gardens. Remember, it's the South, so maybe you could still grow food then, I would imagine. And this was considered a celebration if it was a good harvest, right? So Christmas, as many of us experience who celebrate the holiday, was often a very good time of year, at least the best that they can have, okay? But you're still talking about a slave system, right, in which your destiny is completely controlled, right? And who knows if your family's still together from one Christmas to the next, so still problematic, but better than other days of the year, to be sure. Slaves could be whipped and beaten even for minor offenses. The thing you have to understand, kids, is violence is a key enforcer of slavery in the South because there's no other incentive. The only incentive in most cases to get your work done is to not get whipped. And think about your own existence and think about, mine. Like I have a job that I enjoy for the most part. There are days I don't, right? There are days kids get on my nerves, right? But I have a lot of incentives to do a good job, right? I want your kids to learn, I like learning, okay? We do negotiate contracts and get raises sometimes, right? There's our incentives. Like I'm not going to get whipped if I don't do a good job, right? None of that exists for these people for the most part. It did, there were some plantation owners who once again were maybe more humane than others. So if you don't have those incentives to do a good job, those positive reinforcements, what's the only thing that's going to get you to work? Well, I really don't want to get whipped today. Now, whipping is interesting because it was used a lot, but there were plantation owners who frowned upon it because a beaten slave isn't as productive. But sometimes examples had to be set. If a slave is defiant or lazy, right? Some people may not be motivated to pick cotton if it's not going to benefit them at all, right? So they might get labeled as lazy, right? Okay. Perhaps they need to be, an example needs to be set, right? So we're going to whip them. Sometimes killings occurred. That was rare, but sometimes they happened because examples had to be set. You got to think about the average cost of a slave in these years was a male was $1,000, a female was $800. That's a lot of money in the 1850s to 1860, right? It's a lot of money. So they didn't necessarily want to go around killing a lot of their slaves or beating them to death. But nevertheless, what are your other incentives? Which is why whipping was employed quite often. But there were other things. And let me just see. And if you've gone through this chapter, you might see things like this, right? Restraints that were used that could often be cruel in nature, right? So punishments in which a person isn't getting whipped like this man was, right? Okay. So the drawing of an iron mask, collar, leg shackles, and spurs demonstrates the various cruel and painful instruments used to restrain slaves or just punish them. We're going to give you a timeout and you got to experience this device while you do it. Okay. Right. So the primary incentive is to avoid those types of negative reinforcements. And some of you have taken psychology, and one thing you should know when you take psychology, positive reinforcement typically works better than negative, right? in most cases. Not that negative shouldn't be used sometimes. Okay, let me just check out this slide really quick. Actually, that's probably a good place to end it for today. So on Thursday, we'll talk about the continuing ways in which slaves tried to cope with this existence and tried to develop family ties. Unfortunately, sometimes that was tragic due to the separations that occurred. Okay? Do you guys have any questions of me before I leave you today? Questions or observations? So tomorrow when you come in, we're going to look at those chapter 12 questions. I'm going to put you into small groups. We'll probably have each group present 2 of those. Okay? And so you'll talk for a little bit, be small group to large group discussion about some of those key questions, which is going to deal a little bit with some of the information I presented today, but also some of the information that you should be reading about chapter 12. Okay? All right, my college students, have a good day. Try and enjoy the snow a little bit today. We'll see you.